Hello, everybody. Welcome to the English reading series. We're so happy to have Jennifer Sinor with us today. The English reading series is sponsored by the Department of English and the College of Humanities, with help from Rebecca Casanave and Robert Means and our friends at the library. Please do look for links to Jennifer's work in the chat window following Brock Allen's introduction. We'll also post it a second and possibly a third time to make sure that all attendees can see the links. We will start today with a prayer from Melanie Vandervoort. And following that prayer, Brock Allen will introduce our author today. And then please do remember to join us next week for a reading by Mike White. But now we'll move to Melanie's prayer. Thank you.
Father in heaven, we are grateful to come together today as lovers of art and literature, and we are grateful for Jennifer Sinor and the time that she is giving to us today with her writing. We ask that you bless us with an open ear, that we can hear messages in her work and that we may learn from her writing style and her experience. And we ask that we can go forth and educate others on writing and strengthen our own skills. And we say these things in the name of thy Son, Jesus Christ. Amen.
Writer, teacher, mother, and certified yoga instructor Jennifer Sinor is the author of several books of creative nonfiction, including most recently Sky Songs, Meditations on Loving a Broken World. In the collection, Sinor takes us through the mountains, deserts, and rivers of the West, and along with her on our travels to India. Whether rooted in the dailiness of raising children or practicing yoga, Sinor searches for the places where grace resides. Nicole Walker said of the collection, "I moved into these essays, folded myself between Sinor's patient, pointed, perfect pages, and was fully embraced by her attention, her expansiveness, and her enveloping words." I had the same reaction when last spring I came across Sinor's essay, Cannibal in the Normal School. In it, she examines the act of writing memoir through the lens of chewing her nails, chewing her baby son's nails, swallowing those nails. The act of writing, of pondering and questioning is palpable in her essays. In every topic she probes, the abstract is made physical. Her essays appeared in The American Scholar, Creative Nonfiction, The Writer's Chronicle, The Norton Reader, Utni, The Normal School, and elsewhere. Her memoir, Ordinary Trauma, a series of linked flash nonfiction, is a coming-of-age story about her military childhood during the late Cold War, while her essay collection, Letters Like the Day, returns to her love of women's daily writing and takes inspiration from the letters of Georgia O'Keeffe. The recipient of the stipend in American Modernism, Jennifer has also been nominated for the National Magazine Award. When she is not writing or teaching or spending time with her husband, the poet Michael Souter, and their 2 teenage sons, Jennifer can be found practicing yoga in Logan, Utah. A professor of English, Jennifer teaches creative writing at Utah State University. Please welcome Dr. Jennifer Sinor.
Thank you very much, Brock, for that beautiful introduction. Thank you to Melanie for the beautiful prayer, and to Spencer and Rebecca for doing all the work that they do, not just for this reading, but for the whole reading series. And thank you to Pat Madden for having me in his classes earlier this week. And then a special thank you to all of you. I can't see you. It's a strange experience, but I know you're there and I appreciate you being here today. So I am going to read an essay from Sky Songs. And Sky Songs is a collection of essays that covers about the last 15 years or so. And it begins with the birth of my first son, Aiden, and goes all the way through his first year in high school. And it also, my second son, Kellen, is also in the collection. And the collection itself sort of moves from the literal landscapes of the West, so the mountains and the deserts and hiking and just being in the natural world. And then it moves toward the inner landscape, more of what we find in contemplative practice, in practicing yoga, in meditation, just sort of connecting to maybe those higher aspects of ourselves. So that's sort of the movement of the collection. And today I'm going to read an essay called Taxi Sutra. A sutra is a small, almost like an aphoristic phrase that you find in a lot of Sanskrit texts. And sort of like a koan in Buddhism, a sutra is a really condensed, kind of compact, usually maybe a single or two lines of verse, and that you can spend your whole life studying just one sutra, trying to figure out what its kind of deeper implications are. So this is called Taxi Sutra. And I chose it because, well, for a couple of reasons. One is that it's an example of the braided work I do. So where I'm bringing in a personal story, then I'm bringing in research threads and sort of moving between all of them. I'm really interested in that kind of work. And the other reason I chose it is because it's hard to listen to an essayist read. It's just hard to pay attention for that long. The poets get it easy because they can just write, they can read a poem and then say something witty and then read another poem. But the essayist is in there for the long haul. So I picked an essay where you are fully free to zone out. So if I get to the thread about Patanjali's Yoga Sutras and you are done, you can just move away, think about something else, and you can come back in for the strand that you're most interested in. So it's sort of like you get 3 essays in one. You don't have to listen to all 3. You can just move in and out of them. Okay. So I'm going to read from Taxi Sutra. It will take about 30 minutes to read it. But again, move in, move out. It's meant to be taken wherever you're at. So Taxi Sutra begins with the words of Sri Ramakrishna. And he is a guru that lived in India near the mountain Arunachala. So Sri Ramakrishna says, the reality is one and the same. The difference is in name and form. And this essay is set in our travels to India. And Michael and I were there with our 2 boys. We've been there several times, but this was on our first trip there. And you'll see what happens. 6 weeks into our 3-month stay in India, a taxi ran over Kellen's foot. I will never forget the sight of his shoe pinned beneath the tire. The day had started quietly. By that June morning, we had lived a month and a half in the tiny town of McLeod-Ganj, high up in the Himalayas, where 10,000-foot peaks stood garbed in snow, even in midsummer, and the walk to town for groceries required a perilously steep ascent. We left the cottage around 9 that day, hoping to beat the sun. For the first time in our stay, we turned to go downhill toward Dharamshala rather than up to McLeod-Ganj. Recently, we had learned that we had learned about a Domino's pizza at the top of the town and told the boys it would be a Friday treat. The boys ran ahead, their legs for once in tune with the pull of gravity. The road to Dharamshala was paved, though broken, uneven, and narrow. When the small cars, auto rickshaws, or motorcycles would scream through, we made sure to step to the side. Above, the cloudless sky stretched over our heads and threaded the nearby jagged peaks. On days like this, it seemed like we lived inside a castle, with a mountain-turned turret and jewels for a ceiling. For moments, I could forget the poverty that pulled at our hearts every day, the path to town lined by those asking us for money, those missing limbs, missing parents, missing sight. Walking downhill that morning, sky and mountain all around, I focused on Aiden and Kellen skipping down the slope, and the bulbuls and macaques calling from the trees, inviting us to join their raucous celebration in the limbs of the cedars. The Yoga Sutras were gathered by Patanjali some 2,000 years ago and bound into a text that feels less like a map for the practice of yoga and more like a series of unsolvable riddles. The word sutra is cognate with suture and translates into thread. Containing 196 aphoristic phrases that range from the practical, how to sit in meditation, to the sublime, the esoteric distinction between 2 stages of enlightenment. The sutras attempt to thread together or bind yoga, one of the 6 schools of classical Indian philosophy. Most yoga practitioners in the West have never heard of Patanjali's sutras. Of the sutras themselves, less than 1% are dedicated to the practice of asana, the poses that make up the center of what Westerners call yoga. Patanjali himself, and yoga more broadly, was barely concerned with the position you took when you practiced. Instead, his focus and the focus of the sutras themselves is moksha, which is liberation, freeing the soul. I have long appreciated where Patanjali begins the sutras with ata, the Sanskrit word for now. And beginnings are important in such works, for in most classical Indian philosophy, that which comes first, say in a list, is considered most important. For example, when Patanjali turns his attention to the yamas, those are the ethical practices a yogi should follow, he lists ahimsa, or non-violence, as the first of 5. The commentators over the centuries have stressed the centrality of non-violence to yoga practice. From that, they suggest, stems all the rest. It seems therefore keenly important to consider the first word in the entire work he has undertaken, now. Now, he tells us, is the time for yoga. In a single day last week, 5 students cried in my office. I teach memoir writing to graduate and undergraduate students, classes where I ask them to push hard and explore difficult questions. So it is not unusual for students to reach for the Kleenex during office hours. They are writing about complex and often painful subjects. Most balance work and families as well as school. They are in debt, unsure of their future. Still, 5 in one day is a lot. A woman who had been raped by a family friend at the age of 9 and now battled bulimia as she tried to rid her body 10 years later of the pain. A gay man who had to leave his church in order to live with the man he loved and now asked how God could have abandoned him. A woman who served in the Army Reserve and felt guilty that she hadn't put boots to the ground while her best friend had been killed guarding a dinner party in Iraq. Another young woman who could not lift her hoodie to show me her eyes, but instead gnawed on her fingers, nail beds raw and bleeding. Last, a woman trying to come to peace with both her abortion and her rape. I have been teaching college students for 15 years. The trauma, anxiety, and depression that marked their lives seems to have increased in the past decade. Students on medication, treatment plans, shattering in front of me as they describe what they want to reveal in their art. I carry their stories home with me every day. I read them over the weekend. I send them love in the pre-dawn hours when I take a seat on my meditation cushion and try to quiet my mind. But lately, I have trouble maintaining my center. The heft of their stories keeps me awake at night, presses on my chest, cannot be quieted by breath. India was never quiet. It challenged all of us every single day. Part of the bribe to encourage Kellen to walk to Domino's was a taxi ride home. When we had first arrived in India, we warned the boys that leaving the comforts of the United States would be difficult. Actually, Michael warned them. He had already been to India 3 times and knew what to expect. Heat, he said. Noise, he said. But you really have no idea. After our first excursion to see the Gateway of India in Mumbai, Aiden, who was 10, returned to our air-conditioned hotel room and a fleet of bottled water to collapse on the bed. He declared, "I am never going out there again." But 6 weeks into our time in India, the boys had acclimated to the smells, the animals, the colors, the noise. Kellen hardly flinched when elderly women would come up to him and want to pinch his pale cheeks. Aiden grabbed a monkey stick as soon as we would enter the canopy of cedars to fight off the macaques, just like the locals. What they couldn't bear, the reason Kellen would beg us to stay home in the cottage all day and play games rather than face the walk to town for groceries, was the poverty. Really, none of us could bear it. Even now, years later, I can close my eyes and see the man with no eyes calling namaste at the sound of approaching footsteps. The woman bearing her baby and gesturing finger to lips. The 2 toddlers in a cardboard box on the side of the road. The man whose scarred body had once, it seemed, been inflamed. Every day our vast privilege was made painfully evident, and we found few ways to carry either our fortune or the poverty that surrounded us. A taxi was a luxury, as was the promise of Domino's pizza. At this point into our stay, the boys recognized such things as gifts that many others did not have. Because we insisted that the boys walk everywhere, that is what we do in India, we said, we walk. Kellen gladly accepted the offer, and that meant we were on our way out in the sun, headed to Dharamshala. Given the heat, I think we were all thankful not to have to haul ourselves back up the hill. We reached the town around 11 and stopped at a place for coffee and treats. While we waited for our food, we played Pictionary on sheets of paper I found in my bag. When the boys grew bored of that game, we scrambled words for each other to guess. Kellen stumped us all with chalkboard, jumping up and down at his win. Even though we arrived at Domino's well before lunch, the familiar sounds of already baking pizza greeted us at the door. We put in our order and waited, talking about how good the pizza would taste. 15 minutes later, we had a box with a large cheese pizza, which Michael held in front of him like a platter. We opened the door to the cry of horns, the crush of bodies and the heat, leaving the word chalkboard, the air conditioning, and the familiar blue and red logo behind. Contrast binds yoga together, whether the literal tension found between the crown of a head and the sits bones in a seated pose, or the pause between inhalation and exhalation. Patanjali's yoga as a philosophy presents a dualistic system, one that divides the world into the unmanifest and the manifest. Patanjali uses the term Purusha for the never-changing, eternal unmanifest, that is, the divine, and Prakriti for everything else, the things of this world, our bodies, and in contrast to the Western mind-body split, the mind as well. Often yoga teachers will translate yoga into union or a yoking. The root yuj does mean to yoke, so the translation makes sense. When instructors define yoga this way, they usually mean the yoking of the mind and the body as the example, or the body and the breath, or maybe the body and the spirit. Through awareness of the breath and movement in the posture, one can, they suggest, unite the body and mind. But the commentators of Patanjali's sutras, Edwin Bryant most recently, point out that yoga requires disjoining of two things. By stilling the mind, one recognizes that the body and the mind and the things of this world, the prakriti, are limited and changing and ultimately transitory. Rather than leading you to the divine, they tend to imprison you, make you desire, want, and crave. Only by realizing the changeless Purusha inside yourself, the higher self, or even the soul, can a person escape the bonds of suffering, the endless desire for something other than what we have, and then realize his or her divinity, which is, yoga tells us, our birthright. For Patanjali, the study and practice of yoga allows one to extricate the Purusha, the soul, from the confines of Prakriti. It liberates the divine inside of each person. Importantly, this realization does not arise from headstand, or downward dog, or warrior 1, 2, or 3. Viveka, discrimination, comes from meditation, stilling your mind and taking your awareness into the present moment. It comes from settling into the now. To the 5 students crying in my office last week, I want to add the friend of Jen's, a man not yet 45 who has 2 children and has just been diagnosed with stage 3 cancer. I want to add my mother-in-law who suffered a tiny stroke when, while she was watering her bonsai, walking the dog, reading the Poisonwood Bible, and now writes to me in a cursive I can no longer read. I want to add my sons as well, who hide in their closets and cry, telling me to go away. And then the women in the jail where I teach meditation, no older than my students, specifically the one who started crying when I suggested that she could be a teacher to herself, or maybe the one who broke down when she revealed that the prosecutors were recommending prison, as the fluorescent lights hummed above us, lights that blink and buzz and never dim, sunlight impossible, forgotten, withheld. I pile all these stories at the foot of Friday. I push them under my bed. I send them through the washing machine with the jeans and t-shirts. I sit with them in the car as I drive to the grocery store, where I will fail to remember my great good fortune as I walk down the brightly lit aisles full of food. Maybe that is why Shiva, the god of destruction, has so many hands. Maybe that is why all the deities in the Indian pantheon sprout arms like branches reaching to the sky. There is simply too much to hold. I remember a story about demons overrunning the land and how the villagers prayed to Shiva to save them from blackness and despair. He came down from the sky and took the demons into his body, but he didn't swallow them or spit them out or even end their lives. He just held them with his many hands. I like to think he is still holding them now. Pizza in hand, we left Domino's. Outside the temperature had cooled, clouds gathered above us, and it looked like rain. It's not too hot, I said to the boys. Let's just walk home. The exercise would be good for us all, I reasoned, allow us to earn the pizza we would eat in our cottage. The protests were immediate. You promised. Cars and cows and people swirled around us on the street. The clouds gave everyone the chance to slip out from house or work to buy some groceries or chapati or bunches of greens carried to town on backs from nearby fields. We walked amid the chaos, holding hands and listening for especially insistent horns. No matter the crowd, we always stood out as foreigners, our dress, our skin, the way we flinched when a moped came too close. Which meant that even if we looked like we might need a taxi, several would veer in our direction. Most often we shook our heads. We can walk. Today we actually needed one and none could be found. Near an intersection, a man on foot approached us. Taxi, he asked. Yes. He gestured for us to follow him, and I thought he was taking us up to his taxi, but instead he led us across the street where he stopped on the side of the road and waved his hand. A small white car appeared and the driver inside smiled at us. The car was headed down the hill and we needed to go up, but it was apparent by his emphatic gesturing that we should climb in and he would then turn around. Nearby, cars streamed past, maneuvering around the stopped taxi, the people, and the occasional monkey with far more speed and assurance than I would have been able to manage. Hurry, hurry, pressed the first man. His beige kurta hung to his thighs and a red scarf was knotted at his neck. Michael walked around the car to the front door and got in, while Aiden, Kellen, and I began to clamber in the back. We were still climbing in when the cab started to roll. Only by focusing clearly on an object and stilling your mind can the higher self, the Purusha, be realized. Think of a lake. Most often, the mind generates waves of thought, vritti, that impede our ability to see deeply into the water. The surface roils and churns. When the mind is stilled, the waves settle and the depths of the soul are revealed. Without such focus, the quieting of the waves, the busy mind fixates on everything else in the world, prakriti, and mistakes these objects, everything from a new car to your new child, as something permanent, abiding, or pure. It confuses the manifest for the unmanifest. The fixation of the mind on the breath or a mantra, though, is not enough, Patanjali continues. Liberation doesn't happen if just every now and then you find stillness. Our one-pointed focus must be done without interruption. How long remains unclear. The sutras assure us that liberation can happen within a lifetime, but they also prepare us to work through many cycles of birth and death. Most importantly, Patanjali insists that the one-pointedness must be done with devotion as well. Most Westerners remain unaware of the fact that yoga is essentially theistic. The practice of yoga in the United States, all asana with very little attention to the spiritual, only encourages the secularization of this 3,000-year-old philosophy. But yoga centers on the divine, and Patanjali's sutras become more and more emphatic on this point as you move deeper into the text. By the middle of the book, Patanjali clarifies that the best, quickest, and safest path to self-realization requires one-pointed focus on Ishvara, God alone. Quote, if one lacks faith in Ishvara, enlightenment remains remote. But if one's yoga is permeated with the nectar of devotion, it is very near. No wiggle room exists in the sutras. To free the Purusha from the prakriti that binds it, you must devote yourself entirely to the divine. Surrender to God, the commentaries read, is not an option. It is a mandatory part of the practice. Several weeks ago, I was running in temperatures a few degrees below zero. A thick fog had rolled into the valley overnight from the north, concealing the sky above and the road ahead. My headlamp reflected light back into my eyes, the fog a wall of white. My route takes me into a depression, an area of low-lying fields and few houses. The road descends steeply enough that I can feel the temperature drop as I move down the hill. In the summer, I welcome the cool. In the winter, I dread it. Given the starless sky and thick fog, the air felt close and pressing. High beams of trucks and cars would erupt out of nowhere, not 20 feet from me, to steal what little vision I had. Soon, not even headlights broke the fog. I could not see sky, mountain, or house. I ran blind. At the very bottom of the hill, near the fields that lay empty in the winter, the fog consumed the sound as well. No longer able to hear my footfalls, I ran on air itself. Without sight, smell, sound, without senses, The world around me collapsed into the present moment. This stride, this stride, this stride. Nothing before or behind me, no way to gauge where I was in time or space, all just right now. At that moment, a giant bird swooped down from a roost I could not see. Explosion of sound and motion and body, air alive and beating. The bird brushed across the plane of my shoulders, the tisk of wings against the nylon, the touch certain, firm, and then fleeting. Within seconds, it landed on an irrigation wheel I could barely see on the side of the road. An owl. Into that moment pressed another, the owl that had lifted our cat into the air more than 12 years ago, took her high into the sky before dropping her long body to the ground, 4 talon marks in her belly, too much trouble or weight for the bird to bear. Had I been considered prey by this owl, my long lit body and reflective gear, or had the owl only been taking my measure, touching me, letting me know he was there? He perched on the irrigation wheel, talons to steel, dark shadow and cloud. My heart raced. The feel of his wings still vibrated against my skin. And then Kellen started screaming. Sitting in the middle of the back seat, I looked over at him. At first, I thought he was just scared that the cab had moved, but then he cried even louder, pure panic on his face. I realized the cab had rolled onto his ankle, pinning it to the road. "You're on his foot," I yelled. "Back up, back up." I pushed Aiden out of the far door and followed him into the street. "You've run over his foot," I yelled. "Back up." When I reached the other side of the taxi, I could see the black tire pressing on Kellen's shoe. I didn't know if the car should move forward or backward. I also didn't know if the driver understood the problem. Michael scrambled from the front seat and threw the pizza box to the ground, as well as the groceries we had purchased earlier. Green mangoes wobbled down the hill, followed by a roll of toilet paper. Aiden stood behind both of us, silent and white. "What do we do?" I called to Michael. But just then the taxi lurched backward, freeing Kellen's foot. Michael pulled him into his arms, even though he was out of danger. I kept yelling, "You ran over his expletive foot." I pressed my hand to Kellen's hair and kept repeating, "His foot, his foot." A voice in my head reminded me that people don't really yell in India, at least not like that, and they certainly don't shout profanity in public, but I didn't care. I would be the strange American, the loud one. So I screamed for Kellen and the taxi driver who failed to look. I screamed to the crowds of people gathering and the host of monkeys in the trees. I also screamed for the helplessness I had felt since arriving in India, my inability to carry the poverty that surrounded me. I screamed to the sky for my ignorance, my fortune, my apathy. The crowd thickened around us, several layers deep, voices offering all sorts of advice in English and Hindi. We had seen this kind of swarming around an accident before. When 2 cars ran into each other in a tiny mountain town, we had watched the people gather to comment, help, and chide. A man, maybe the one who had led us to the taxi, I could not tell from all the hands reaching toward me, kept trying to take Kellen's shoe off, but I batted his hand away. "Hospital, hospital," the people offered. "Jennifer, take his shoe off," Michael said. He held Kellen, who no longer wailed. Instead, he buried his face in Kellen's shoulder, wishing, I imagined, to be home. "Does your foot hurt when I try and take your shoe off?" I asked him. His head shook back and forth, so I gently worked the shoe, then the sock free. The skin around his ankle throbbed angry red, the flesh raked but not broken open. Blood welled to the surface, tiny drops in rows running from lower shin to heel. He could, though, flex his foot and wiggle his toes. It didn't appear broken. Taking Kellen from Michael, I held him to my body. He clung to my neck, but said nothing. "You must have been so scared, Kellen. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. You must have been so scared." I could feel his body shake. Adrenaline pumped through my own body. I too was trembling. I tried to make out specific faces in the crowd, but I felt like a spectacle. I didn't want anyone's help. I didn't want to see individuals. I just wanted to be gone from there. "Do you want to take a taxi home, or do you want me to carry you?" I asked Kellen. "Carry me," he said. So I lifted my 8-year-old son and began to climb the hill. In Patanjali's yoga, I appreciate most his insistence that the things of the world made of Prakriti are not illusion. Taxis and monkeys and pizza boxes are not to be seen as ancillary or unimportant in the pursuit of the eternal. Plenty of other spiritual traditions encourage their followers to reject this earth, this existence, in favor of a better one in the future, the one that waits after death. I think of my gay students who are told to tread water during this lifetime because they will receive a new body, a heterosexual body, in the next. Instead, Patanjali suggests Prakriti exists to give us opportunities to liberate the soul. Practice is how I think about it. Every object, every thought, every relationship, every moment of our day provides us with the chance to see the possibility of the divine. The world shows us how to learn to love. But here is where I also part ways with Patanjali. For although he sees the purpose of Prakriti and providing experiences in which we can discriminate the unmanifest, the divine, from the manifest, everything else, he does not see the manifest as divine in its own. Prakriti for Patanjali might be useful, but is not holy, and I have been touched by an owl. We made our way up the mountain, Michael and Aidan burdened with the groceries we had bought, me carrying Kellen on my back. Cars and motorcycles whipped past, trucks pushed us to the narrow dirt margin. I kept asking Kellen if he was fine. It's okay, Mom, he reassured me, mouth against my ear. It hurts like a bad scrape. Halfway home, we passed a cow with only 3 legs, a birth defect perhaps. The calf wobbled between the rocks and the tufts of withered grass. His brown eyes seemed too large for his small face, and his missing leg caused his body to lean at an angle against the mountain. We have to do something for him, Aidan said. I slid Kellen from my back to a low rock wall and waited for Michael to reach us. Sweat ran down my face and arms, even though clouds still hid the sun. Michael arrived, laden with everything but Kellen, and the 4 of us considered the calf, who did not shy away at our approach. What's left of the groceries? I asked Michael. He looked into the newspaper-wrapped balls and pulled out a head of cauliflower. We halved it and offered it to the cow, grateful for something to give. When I picked Kellen back up and returned to the mountain climb, I realized that much of my anger had left me. I was still worried that we might have to take Kellen to a hospital, that some tiny foot bones had been fractured, that his injury could have been so much worse. Maybe it was the effort required to keep moving up the hill, or the press of Kellen's body to my back, or the cow on the side of the road who walked the flank of a mountain on 3 legs. But I felt far away from the woman who had screamed obscenities to the sky, the one who sought some kind of crazy justice, the one who refused to accept the world as offered. On that Friday morning, at the end of a week in which 5 students had cried in my office and the inmates had crumpled under fluorescent lighting, and night after night I had watched the hours march forward from 1 a.m. to 2 a.m. to 3 a.m. as I worried, regretted, and planned, I closed my eyes and returned to my breath. I am breathing in, I said to myself. I am breathing out. Winter dark soaked the living room, 3 candles the only light. In my lap I held nothing, or I held everything, my students, the inmates, Kellen's foot pinned beneath a tire. I am breathing in, I am breathing out. Nothing moved in the house, not the cats or the boys asleep down the hall, nor the spruce outside the picture window. In the now, the atta, the story I told about my students, myself, my son, fell away. The now contains no beginning, no middle, no end. It searches not into the future, nor does it cling to the past. I sat without seeing, hearing, or touching, and awaited the glance of owl. Shiva stood in front of me, candle lit below. Though my eyes remained closed, I knew light danced on all his arms. Here is a thing about the taxi in India. For 2 years, I carried the story as one of harm or near miss. I pointed to that moment in our travels as a place where disaster was averted or anger justified or a man failed to look. But the other day I realized that that moment on the mountain marks the last moment I carried my son. It records the end of an 8-year period that began with his birth. Years in which I held him in my arms, first because he could not walk, later because I wanted to move more quickly than his toddler legs would go, and still later when he sought solace after a fall or a failure. Yes, Kellen still climbs into my lap sometimes or will snuggle with me on the couch when we read, but he weighs too much for me to actually pick up. I cannot physically bear him any longer. I do not know the day I last carried Aidan. It has faded into the past unmarked. But the taxi in India has given me that moment with Kellen. The brush with harm fastened my attention to his breath in my ear, the press of his body to my back, his weight heavy but certain. Now, Patanjali tells us, is the time for yoga. And how rarely do we actually practice? Look to the objects of the world as a place to see the divine, he insists, and we avert our eyes. The owl skims my shoulder blades. Kellen breathes in my ear. The calf eats our cauliflower, and a student hands me not her suffering, but a stone from a path of healing she has hewn on her own. The manifest and the unmanifest are not joined, but the same. Now is the time. All right, you guys. Thank you. Everybody is clapping. That's very kind. So I would love to have some questions from you guys. Let me see. I'll look and see if you're already asking me questions. Oh, you are. Okay. So somebody is asking me, they say that I've written a few books so far. What is the publishing process like, and how closely do you work with editors? So, and I'm going to really pay attention to time. Okay. So there are lots of ways to publish, as I'm sure you guys are well aware of, and I've tried pretty much all of them. And I guess the thing I would like to say about publishing is that you just can't give up. So if you look at my memoir, Ordinary Trauma, it came out in 2017. The first piece I wrote that is in Ordinary Trauma, I wrote in 1997. You guys do the math. That's probably more than you guys have even been alive, right? So 20 years. So in some ways, that book took 2 decades to write. And I cannot tell you how many times I revised it. I mean, a million times. At first, I was looking for a commercial publishing house. I had a literary agent. They were shopping it around. And this was in 2008. That's when there was an economic collapse and publishing took a big hit. And so I decided I wasn't going to go that route. So then I pulled the book and I revised it entirely for more of like a literary audience, which is a smaller audience. A literary audience, you know, you're most likely not going to be, well, we don't have bookstores anymore, but in the old days, you would not be featured at Barnes and Noble if you're writing for a literary audience. So I revised it for a literary audience and I began to look at contests and academic presses. And I guess I would say this about writing, if you're a serious writer and you're interested in literary writing, that right now I feel like the academic presses and the small publishing houses, the really small ones, the boutique ones, they're doing the most interesting work because they're willing to take risks on their writers. A big publishing house, they don't want to take a risk. They want a sure thing. So they want to know, like, you know, do you have 10,000 million followers on your whatever? And then they'll take a chance on you. So a lot of it depends on who you think your audience is. There are also a lot of writers who are self-publishing these days. I have not done that. That's a publishing that I've not done. There are some advantages, and you guys know that there are a lot of very successful writers, especially genre fiction writers, are experiencing a lot of success in self-publishing. So at that point, you have to do a lot of the work on your own. That's actually true of publishing in general. The person who asked the question asked how closely you work with editors. It sort of depends on the press. The difference, like say, between self-publishing and working with like a university press is if you're self-publishing, you're in charge of all of it. So that's great. You're in charge of everything. So you get to pick your cover and you get to decide what the names of your chapters are and the font you're going to use and all of that. So there's a lot of freedom there, but you also don't get a lot of support. You have to really trust that you know what you're doing. The opposite side, if you're publishing like with a literary press or with academic presses, you don't have a lot of say in some of the decisions. So for example, the cover, it just appears one day in your inbox. Here's the cover of your book. So that's also a little bit strange. My latest experience with Nebraska was my best experience because they sent me to a copy editor who was the best copy editor I've ever worked with. She was a really good reader and read really closely. So I worked very closely with her. So I think it sort of depends what your audience is, and also it depends what you're writing, and it depends if you've already got a base. So for example, if you've already got a blog that a lot of people are following, well, self-publishing might make sense to you. But if you're trying to, I don't have that kind of platform. I'm not a social media person. So for me, academic presses made more sense. So, okay, hope that answers that question. So somebody is asking about why we went to India. That's a really good question. So we went to India because my partner, Michael Sauter, received a Fulbright to go to India. And let's see, is that the first time he went to India? Actually, he may have gone to India before that. So because Michael and I are both deeply into yoga, and because yoga, the deep roots of yoga come from the Indian subcontinent, we're very interested in India as a place. And we're interested in the kinds of stories and mythologies that come out of India, the landscape of India, the people, the temples, all of that. And so Michael eventually did receive a Fulbright to go to India. I guess that was the second time he was there. And that's when we went, and we were there for 3 months. And then we've since been back twice after that. And we've just traveled to different parts of India, trying to just see more and more of the country. And I don't know, India is either a place you love or hate. It's not, there's no like middle road on India, at least as far as I can tell. You either go there and become just completely enthralled to the challenge that's India, like the beauty and the brightness and the craziness, as well as the difficulty and the struggle and all of that. That either makes you feel excited, or you go there and it drains you and you can't wait to get home. And so I remember after that first trip, maybe, like every time you step out the doors in India, you have no idea what's going to happen. Like there might be an elephant walking down the road, or who knows? It's just all sorts of zany all the time. And that can be difficult, but it's also just, fun. And then I remember I came back here and I was just taking a walk around our neighborhood. We have a lovely neighborhood. It's a great place to live. But I remember thinking, there is not going to be a surprise around the next corner. It's going to be another green lawn. Some kid's going to be riding their bike. Someone's going to be walking their dog. Like that's what's going to happen. And I already know it. And so there's something about traveling in general, but in traveling into India particularly, that there's this thing about just the promise of surprise, which is exhausting but exhilarating. So that's why we travel there. That and a bunch of other reasons. Okay, so somebody is asking me about my pandemic journal and how it's helping me, and how writing in general is an act of healing, which I actually firmly believe. So I'm a longtime journal keeper. I've been, like many of you, I started a diary when I was a little kid. I still have it. It's a silly diary that I treasure deeply. I've not written consistently since the age of 7. I've been a better and a worse journaler, but journaling has been a part of my life. So I believe really strongly in that kind of writing, and I could talk about it in any number of ways. Like I could talk about it in terms of, as a writer, I believe in what's called low stakes writing, where it doesn't matter what you write. And there's something really important about having a space where there are no stakes. You can just do whatever you want on the page. So from a writer's perspective, I would talk about journaling that way. From another perspective, I would talk about just, if you don't write about your days, you're not going to remember them. We don't have the capacity to remember everything that's happened to us. Sure, we'll remember the big things, but it's the little things that I'm interested in keeping a hold of. And so journaling allows us to document the daily. And I don't even know, I don't even go back and read my journals, but there's something really reassuring about knowing that they're there, and knowing that there are all of these moments in my life that I have fastened to the page. So when the pandemic hit, it was a Thursday for us when the university shut down. And I just immediately came home and decided I would keep a pandemic journal. And so last night was day 221. Last day was, it was 222, because it was October 22nd was day 222. I thought that was interesting. So that's where we're at right now in my pandemic journal. Others might have a different count. So I write every day what day it is, what day in the pandemic it is. And then I actually have been spending a little more time writing about external events than I normally do. So for me, journal keeping is very much about inward focus. What am I feeling about? Sometimes writing through things that are hurt, that are painful. So trying to sort through things that are confusing or bringing me down, right? That's the way I usually use the page. But actually with the pandemic journal, I've been a little more outwardly focused. So I record the kind of things that are happening in the world around me. I record the COVID case count for our county. And a lot of my pandemic journal is filled with uncertainty. I mean, that's really the thread through all those 222 entries or whatever it is just not knowing. It's interesting, lately I've heard people talking about the Stockdale syndrome. I don't know if you guys have heard this yet, but I see it more and more. And this goes back to a man that was kept as a prisoner of war. And the reason he survived being a prisoner of war and came out, you know, relatively intact as you can from a situation like that is because he never assumed it would be over. And that's what allowed him to get through. So lately with the pandemic in general, I've sort of been trying to take that focus, like stop wondering when is it going to end, and just instead trying to be really present with where I'm at in my day. In that way, writing is deeply healing. It's deeply healing because I can reassure myself that it's not about what's around the corner. It's about what happened today, what's happening in my life. And then writing in general is always therapeutic. And there are all sorts of studies that support the fact that in some ways, journaling acts as like talk therapy, but you're both the analyst and the analysand. You're the therapist and the patient. And so you're doing both sets of work. You're asking the questions and you're answering. And in that way, you're literally healing yourself in the same way talk therapy works. So that was a very long question, but I'm very interested, or a very long answer to a very good question. But I'm really interested in how writing can be healing and how magical it is that you never have to show anybody that work. It doesn't matter whether you put it out into the world. What matters is you wrote it down in the first place. So that's all you have to do is write. And you can start by just writing about whatever it is in your life. And no one's going to see it. So it doesn't really matter. You can say whatever you want. You can be the smallest person, the meanest person, the most impatient person. Nobody's going to see it. All right, so let me just keep reading the questions. I have 3 minutes. Okay. Okay, so someone is asking me, I have many questions. Okay, someone's asking about, in my memoir, Ordinary Trauma, sharing personal stories from when I was young and whether I remember the details or whether I asked my family. That's a very good question. A lot of memoirists will go and interview their family and find out what the different takes are. I didn't do that. I just know that my version of the past is literally my version, and I'm very aware of that. I understand that every member of my family would tell a very different story. So like at the end of Ordinary Trauma, there's a story about when I'm 19. I think I'm 19, and I go on a family trip in a huge Winnebago with my family. And for me, it was horrible. It was this horrible experience. And my dad remembers it as the best summer ever. So I often think we were just in different Winnebagos. Like this was my Winnebago, this was his Winnebago. So I'm okay with there being different versions. I don't believe in any kind of like single unified version of the past. And I'm always most interested in why I want to remember the way I want to remember, because that reveals so much about who I am and what my stakes are in my own story. That matters. That really matters. Why do you want to remember it this way? It doesn't really matter whether your memory lines up with someone else's memory. It's more, why is that the story you're invested in? And that's worth interrogating and thinking through. All right, I have 1 minute left. Somebody is asking me about the essay I just read, about whether the research came first or the narrative. They all come at the same time. Oh, that's okay. They all come at the same time. Okay. So for me, what I want to write about is whatever's intersecting in my life at a particular moment. And because I read a lot and because I'm interested in things in the world, this often involves research. Now, of course, I don't just stay with the limited thing I know about, say, Patanjali. I actually took a whole long course on Patanjali and read a bunch of books on Patanjali because Patanjali's hard. I want to get it somewhat right. So I take what's intersecting in me right now, and I trust that if it's intersecting in my body, it's going to intersect on the page, and it's going to be meaningful if I can figure out what the intersections say. So I'll have the research, and then I'll have to go do more research, and then I'll start weaving together on the page. Okay, that's a great question. You guys have lots of good questions, but I do not want to make you late for your class. So I just want to thank you so much for being here. I wish I could see, well, first, I wish I could be there. And second, I wish I could see your beautiful faces, but I will just imagine you there and say thank you for allowing me to spend this time with you. Take care.
Thank you so much, Jennifer. I wish you could see the faces of the 110 people in attendance here.
Oh,
It was a fantastic reading.
thank you.
Thank you all for joining us this week. Thanks for coming to the reading series, and don't forget to visit the links in the chat window. And please remember, same time next week for a reading by Mike White. We'll see you next time.